Welcome to Maximizing Your Nitrogen Dollar. This is the second of a four-part webinar series brought to you by OMAFRA. I'm Colin Elgie, and I will be your host for the session today. So if you missed our first session, we took a look at the science of nitrogen, the nitrogen cycle, where nitrogen comes from and how it can be lost, and how our fertilization affects greenhouse gas emissions. Today, we're going to have a focus on nitrogen management in horticulture crops and some of the specific practices to help improve nitrogen use efficiency within them. Obviously, due to the vast variety of hort crops, we won't be able to get through every single one, but we are hoping that you have questions that we can answer in the discussion following the presentations. So I'm going to give each of our speakers a quick introduction now, and then I will pass the torch over to them. So our first speaker is Dr. Mario Tenuta. He's a professor at the Department of Soil Sciences and heads the Applied Soil Ecology Lab at the University of Manitoba. From 2006 to 17, he served as the Canada Research Chair in Applied Soil Ecology. Mario is one of the 9 leading researchers in the Canadian 4R Research Network. Most recently, he was named the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada Industrial Research Chair in 4R Nutrient Stewardship. Our next speaker is Elaine Roddy, vegetable crop specialist with OMAFRA. She's been working with OMAFRA for 25 years after receiving a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture and Natural Resources Management from the University of Guelph. In the early 2000s, she conducted on-farm sweet corn nitrogen use efficiency trials at 30 different field sites. Elaine works with a variety of crops as OMAFRA specialist for sweet corn, cucurbits, beans, peas, and asparagus. Our final speaker will be Joe Tomecek with Tomecek Agronomy Services. In 2008, Joe became a certified crop advisor, and since then has helped to expand the services that Tomecek Agronomy offers to include consulting services on a variety of crops, soil sampling, crop planning, research projects, and data management. Joe prides himself on helping his clients achieve their production goals as an independent agronomist through an environmentally friendly approach. Joe is currently working towards his master's degree in plant pathology at the University of Guelph. So with that, I'll pass the reins over to Dr. Mario Tenuta and give us a bit of a rundown in potatoes.
Great, thank you, Colin. Let's see if I can make this magic happen. Can you see that first slide?
You are good to go, sir.
All right, excellent. Well, this is a pleasure to be here. Well, I guess I'm not there with you. Virtually, we're here together. I'm maximizing nitrogen use efficiency. I'm going to focus on potato. And there we go. The nitrogen cycle. So last week, the nitrogen cycle was the focus. And here, just giving a little bit of a review on that. And particularly, I'm going to focus in on 2 areas in the top right-hand corner. And that is forms of loss of nitrogen as nitrous oxide emissions. Now, why am I talking about that largely today? Well, it's because we have targets for reduction of that N2O. There's lots of questions out there by growers and industry of really, are these targets realistic? Can we achieve them? And how can we achieve them? And so that's what we're going to touch on today. So in the nitrogen cycle, when we add our fertilizer, it's often in most of it's in the ammonium form, and we'll nitrify to nitrate, and then our crop will take it up, such as potato. And however, the emissions or loss of that nitrogen can occur. The process of going from ammonium to nitrate via nitrification, we can have N2O emissions, nitrous oxide, through nitrification. There's also another pathway of loss, which is denitrification, which is nitrate going to N2O or nitrous oxide. Both of these processes are mediated by soil organisms, primarily soil bacteria. So these are natural processes that are occurring. And whenever we have nitrogen cycling in soil, it's inevitable that some of that nitrogen will be lost as these forms. Now, our greatest challenge, of course, is to reduce the losses. of nitrous oxide and other forms of nitrogen as well. We're not going to be able to talk about those other losses today because we just have a very short time. Now, why is there such discussion about N2O and its reduction? So I'm giving you an example here of a province heavily in agriculture, Saskatchewan. And when we look at agriculture in green, it makes up a big chunk of emissions. Now, the scenario in Ontario is a little different because you have so much more industry. But like on the prairies where I'm from, at least Saskatchewan, Manitoba, this big chunk of green are greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, food production. And if we break that down, what these emissions really are, it comes down to the majority is N2O emissions, actually nitrous oxide emissions, which is a greenhouse gas. So our agricultural food production is the major source of this greenhouse gas. And so that's why, in terms of looking at means or ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for the whole country, all sectors are looked at to contribute to those reductions, and agriculture is really particularly being looked at for nitrous oxide, and particularly from fertilizers, the emissions of N2O from fertilizers. There's a commitment. It's a commitment. It's not a regulation. It's not a law. It's a commitment to target to reduce emissions by a third by the time 2030 comes around. And so that's what we're going to be exploring here today. Can we be doing that, particularly with potato? Now, some perspectives on N loss. I think this is really important for us to wrap our heads around. One of them is that annual emissions of nitrous oxide are pretty low when it comes really down to it in terms of pounds of nitrogen loss, okay? 0.5 to 4 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year lost as N2O from farm fields. N2O, though, is very powerful greenhouse gas, 300 times more than CO2. So it does add up in terms of making an impact in terms of warming the atmosphere. But really, you don't really care. I wouldn't say you don't care about half a kilo or 4 kilos. It's money lost, of course, but compared to leaching or volatilization losses, it's on the minor side. Okay, but environmentally, it's very important because of that potency as a greenhouse gas. So really with N2O, we're really talking about an environmental concern, okay? Now, how do we do our studies? Key thing that we do is we do studies often in farm fields. This case, we're doing plot scale on a farm field, and we will try to mimic as much as possible as a commercial producer would do for potato. And we monitor greenhouse gas emissions with these contraptions here. We call them collars, and we would fit a lid. Here's a lid right here that would go on it, seal up, and then this case, the student is sampling the gas with a syringe that collects in this, we could refer to it as a chamber when the lid is on, okay? And then we can take those gases back to the laboratory and analyze them and find out the progress in time. And it's about over 40 minutes, how much gas accumulates over 40 minutes. And we can get what we refer to as a flux rate from that. Now, in potatoes, very interesting because we have hills. And we need to sample on the hill, and we need to sample in the furrow as well. So it adds a little bit more complexity than some, let's say, field row crops. This is the N2O emissions, and here's progress over the growing season. So it's in days, so you can say 150, what does that take us into? That's taking us into May, June, right? And so a little bit later, actually. Here is emissions from the hills, and here's from the furrows. And we can see in 2009, the emissions all came from the hills. And it came after fertilizer addition, and then we have emissions occurring. The furrow in 2019, not much was happening at all. No emissions. You don't see a spike, right? We moved to 2010, and the emissions from the hills, not so much, but emissions from the furrows much higher, particularly early on. So this is really interesting because we have difference in space in the field where the emissions are occurring. 2009 was a drier year. The emissions were largely in the hills following a rainfall that triggered the bacteria to do transformations and N2O emissions. In 2019, we had early rainfall that moved the nitrogen into the furrows. Actually, our furrows were pooled with water. So the nitrogen had moved into the furrows, and that's where the emissions were coming. So it's very interesting. I just wanted to show you some of the complexity that it can change where the emissions are occurring in the field, and it depends with water, and particularly in terms of moving that nitrogen so that it can be lost. So the results I'm going to show you are taking into account the hills and the furrows together to give an emissions for basically the field. Now, how do we go about looking at reducing emissions? Well, the 4 R's. Right, rate, source, placement, and timing. You've heard a lot about this. We'll talk more about it. In particular, we're talking about some of the practicality and what can be done. Looking at rate, this is processing potato that we have to irrigate here because we have less water than you, and russet Burbank. And we get that out of the way if that's in your way. You can see that as we increase our fertilizer nitrogen rate, and that's basically urea, so we increase the rate, there's a linear relationship in terms of the N2O emissions, okay? So it's very clear cut in terms of more nitrogen added, more N2O emitted. Could probably do the same thing with manure, and it would show similar relationship, okay? So, and it really, most nitrogen forms that we would add, even organic nitrogen forms, can lead to N2O emissions. So nothing particularly particular about fertilizers, but this thing about the rate, the more nitrogen you put in, the more N2O emissions that can come out. So one of the key things is use our nitrogen wisely in terms of optimizing our nitrogen applications so that we don't over apply and we're applying at the most economical return for nitrogen. And so that's what we want to be doing. In my neck of the woods, 240 is way too much. Okay, we're more in the 180 to 200 range where it becomes more economically important. I also want to point out, and this is the case with field crops in Manitoba, and that when we start getting really high rates with field crops, bordering on excessive for them, we really do get a spike in or an increase. It stops becoming linear, okay, and we start getting much more N2O emissions. So the whole session today will be looking at optimizing those nitrogen rates. It's really an important part of reducing N2O emissions. I'm going to now move to some of the things that we can do to reduce emissions. And one of them is using enhanced efficiency nitrogen fertilizer. So here we're talking about stabilized nitrogen or inhibitor nitrogen products, controlled release or polymer coated urea as products, okay? And for the stabilizers, there's a plethora of products on the market. There's urease inhibitors that are shown on the top. Then there are nitrification inhibitors in the middle, and then it's referred to as double or dual inhibitors, which are a combination of urease and nitrification inhibitors. The urease inhibitors, and stay with me on this, the urease inhibitors are designed to prevent ammonia volatilization when we're adding urea to soil, in particular where urea is prone to be left at the surface of soil or the surface of leaves. And so the next is nitrification inhibitors, which are designed to slow down nitrification. And for reasons we don't know exactly yet, it also reduces N2O emissions from the nitrification process. And this is what we found really reduces N2O emissions, use of the nitrification inhibitors. And if you use a dual inhibitor, which includes both of these inhibitors, it's really the nitrification component, the inhibitor component, that really reduces emissions. Let me show you some things, some results. This is, again, irrigated potato, russet Burbank for processing. Urea emissions, so we added urea, then we got a rainfall right here, and then boom, we're getting emissions. So this is a spring planted, at planting, urea added, broadcast, and incorporated. Then we added, or not then, we at the same time, in other treatments, we added ESN, or the polymer coated. And the ESN is the cross mark. And we can see that it's lower at the beginning than the regular urea, and maybe a little bit later on, still produces N2O later. It's because of that delayed release of ESN. It's kind of delayed in terms of the emission. Makes sense. We go to a split system where we delay the nitrogen application, or either some at planting and then at hilling or hill completion. What do you see? Lower peaks, right? We're not up here anymore with that broadcast incorporated, that one-shot deal of that urea. And this is really neat, because what is happening is that we're adding fertilizer later on, and the conditions are drier generally, because we're not coming out of winter with the snow melt and so forth like that, and we get less N2O emissions. And when we fertigate, which means we hold off some of that nitrogen and we applying it in growing season, so you add some at the beginning, at planting, at hilling, and then putting on 15 pounds, 20 pounds weekly through irrigation, through a pivot. And we're still not seeing much N2O emissions with that as well. So that split has been very effective. And we've shown this with other crops, particularly corn and canola and on the prairies, to be very effective in reducing N2O emissions. And we look at in 2012, another year, just generally lower emissions because it was drier year, but here you can still see the urea being more than the ESN and polymer coated. And when we do the split applications, we still get a little bit of emissions. This was actually from the at plant portion of the nitrogen, not much going on later on. So even that nitrogen, even though we're adding nitrogen later on, it's not getting turned to N2O emissions because it's generally drier. That's even though we're irrigating, okay? So it's pretty amazing, actually. And here's a summary of some of this work where you can see that we have a yearly difference or variation in N2O emissions. You know, it's 4 times higher in 11 than 12 in terms of amount of N2O lost. And then when we look at the different treatments in terms of ESN, so we have to compare this to, let's say, the U200, urea 200 kilograms of N, broadcast incorporated, 172. And we can see that if we add ESN, broadcast incorp doesn't do very much. It's the same emissions. We start banding that ESN. In other words, we at planting, we band it. In this case, it's 2 bands to the side of the seed piece and below. We get reduction in N2O emissions. And you can see here, it's not statistically, but it's definitely repeatable in terms of a reduction. So we start seeing some patterns in terms of reductions of N2O. And here's another experiment just summarizing that. Here you can see that we look at the urea, or there are comparison here of urea all broadcasted, incorporated at planting. And when we do ESN, the polymer coated, again, a numerical difference, lowering, dropping. If we split, save some of the nitrogen for at hilling, drastic reduction. And there's still a reduction when we go to fertigation, even holding back some nitrogen later on. So, we can make really good progress in terms of reducing emissions by split application and even also by banding the nitrogen. Now I want to show you about the inhibitors. And this is work done with wheat in Manitoba with how many years here? 6 site years, or maybe, it's 8 site years. And here is a urea. Here's emissions of N2O with urea at planting. But we go to Super U, which is a dual inhibitor, drastic reduction in N2O emissions. With a single nitrification inhibitor, the same drastic reduction in emissions, okay? We're going to start doing this work with potato next year, right across the country, actually in 5 different provinces. And we're going to be getting data for the first time with our inhibitors on potatoes. So I hope to update you on that, but I'm pretty certain, because we have a lot of data on nitrification inhibitors, and they seem to always reduce N2O emissions. So I'm hopeful that they will do potato. Now, it's about economics, this series. Let's talk a little bit about economics. This stuff costs money, right? And then let's look at the case of the nitrification and urease inhibitors. Here's the cost of urea that I was able to hunt around from retailers and so forth, translated into dollars per pound. And this is the cost with the inhibitors, okay? And here is the dollars per acre. Then assuming a $200 pound nitrogen per acre rate. So the products do cost money, and just 254 for the urea. Now compared to a nitrification inhibitor, that's what is that? $16 more? No, not 16. I'm not a very good subtracting right now. And you can see, but there's a premium cost. Now, how do you pay for that premium cost? Well, the farmer can say, well, I'm going to get more yield, or I need to get more yield. Well, with potato, so I'm using here $18 for a bag. It would take for this nitrification inhibitor to not quite pay itself, but at least to get a return that was equivalent to the cost. That would be 1.3 bag increase in yield. Now that's not, of course, a farmer doesn't get to keep the whole price of the bag as profit. So let's say they're making 5% profit on the bag, okay? Well, we'd have to multiply this by 20, okay? So now we're over 20 bag increase in yield, okay? To start to truly break even for this cost. So that's what you have to ask yourself. If you're using some of these products, are you getting an increase in yield, okay? Now, if you don't get an increase in yield from your past practices, you got to make up that money somehow, or else you're dipping into your profit. So one thing to do is you may consider decreasing your nitrogen rates. So this is a decrease in nitrogen rate from 200 pounds to break even for these different inhibitors, okay? Now, does this make sense to drop the nitrogen rate? Well, it does to me, because these inhibitors are designed to reduce losses of nitrogen as N2O, but also other forms like leaching and volatilization if it's a urease inhibitor. If you're losing less nitrogen, that means there's more in the soil, which means you can probably adjust your nitrogen rates for that. So this would be the break-even points then for that. So I tell growers, if you're not getting an increase in yield, think about reducing your nitrogen rates, or else you're losing money. Now there's another way a farmer can break even, and that's by playing the market, and that's the carbon market. So what does the value of carbon, CO2, need to be to pay for these inhibitors? The nitrification inhibitors and the ESN do reduce N2O emissions. And and I'm assuming here 30% reduction in N2O with those products, which is very conservative. It's much higher than that actually. But anyway, let's be conservative, okay, in terms of and if you convert the N2O into CO2 savings, somebody may pay you for that on the market. Well, what's the value of that CO2 need to be? Well, $31 a ton, $38 a ton, $29 a ton to break even for these different inhibitor products. And that we're about there for our carbon market pricing. So, obviously you're not going to get all this money as a farmer because you have to pay somebody to do the paperwork and aggregate all these emissions and various things like that. Okay. But that's a third way to break even. Actually, there's a fourth way of helping you to break even. And that's what Margaret's going to talk about afterwards if you stick around. Okay. And that is to get some help to pay for the cost of these products. Okay. As we wrap up, I just want to look at more at yield. Now, you notice I didn't talk much about yield up to now, and that's because those treatments really didn't change yield much. But they were environmentally very good by reducing N2O emission. So here's a very comprehensive study where we did a plethora of treatments looking at splitting nitrogen at different timings and going all the way up to fertigation, and then broadcast incorporating or banding the nitrogen that would be plant, okay, and then even polymer coated nitrogen. And what I want to show you here is 3 years of data of 2 different sites. And here's the controls with no nitrogen. Let's look at the UBI, urea, broadcast incorporated as our checks. And then look, scan down. And the treatments can increase the nitrogen, the marketable yield of processing potato, okay? But we're only really looking at about a 3 to 6% increase in the yield, okay? So when we start getting at the point where then these practices cost money. So we're at the borderline of them paying for themselves or not. Okay, so what I talked about here, very important. You have to ask yourselves, well, how do I have these products, these things pay for themselves? Okay. And I'm going to leave it there because I'm probably gone way over my time and lots of people to thank. And I want to thank you for your attention and thanks for the invitation to be here with you today.
So just while Stephanie is switching over to my slide deck, as mentioned earlier, I'm Elaine Roddy, and the crops that I work on are sweet corn, beans, peas, asparagus, and then all of the cucurbit crops. And so in some ways, it's not the best crops to focus on for maximizing your nitrogen dollar in horticulture crops, because in the work that we've done, either myself or Laura Van Aert here on Ridgetown campus, some grower studies that have occurred, none of those crops are really highly responsive to nitrogen compared to some of the other vegetable crops. So, but on the plus side, I think that these are crops that we can focus on when we're looking at the economic analysis of nitrogen prices right now. These are some crops where we probably can successfully reduce rates while not impacting yield. As hard as it is to deal with that fear of missing out, I think that these are crops in the work that we've done that gives us that opportunity to shave some of our costs. So this work is going back to, just being a little slow to respond here. So the work itself that I want to, oh, here we go. The work itself that I'm going to be referring to is work that we did here in Southwestern Ontario in the throughout the 2000s. So starting in 2003, and we finally wrapped it up in 2010. So the data itself is getting old at this point in time. And so there's always that fear that, it's old data. What is it? What does it mean now? What do yield increases mean? And I think my take home message from this data set compared to the previous recommendations that were established 40 years before that even is that increases in yields do not necessarily translate to a proportional increase in the amount of nitrogen required, because the plants do get more efficient at what they're doing as part of that yield increase. So to start off, when we got into this work, the question that we wanted to answer that growers were asking me was, if I want to grow 10 ton sweet corn, what is my nitrogen rate required? Because the nitrogen rates that we had at that time, 90 kilograms to the acre, 80 pounds to the acre, they seemed a lot lower compared to what other neighboring jurisdictions were doing. And that's the example of this slide here, is that Florida, which is a fresh market industry, so it is different economics. Florida, they're applying up to 200 pounds to the acre. The Midwest is well within the range of what we're doing. Michigan slightly higher, and New York slightly higher again for what they were recommending at the time. And so growers were really questioning whether they needed more nitrogen to be able to get that 10-ton yield goal. And yeah, a lot of the nitrogen expertise from a grower standpoint in processing sweet corn comes from field corn. So they get used to doing one thing in field corn, and does that translate to what they need in their sweet corn crops? So that's what we wanted to address. The Minnesota recommendations are a lot more detailed. I really like them. But again, you're looking at on high tonnage crops, you're looking at considerably more nitrogen than what we are currently recommending in OMAFRA. So we got into these trials. We did, it was actually 27. I'd said 30 to Colin, but it was 27 different locations over that 8-year period that we did it at. And we tended to focus on the late season high yielding varieties on medium textured soils. We did have some earlier stuff and some coarser textured soils, but the bulk of this database is that late season medium textured soils. And one of the things we wanted to do was to assess the pre-side dress nitrogen test in addition to our rate responses on the nitrogen. So if we go back into the database, when I first opened it up, having not looked at it in a number of years, and if I went back to my 50 cents a pound for nitrogen, and that's 28% UAN that we're basing it on, and at that time was a $78 per ton sweet corn price. Over that database, over those 27 sites, we ended up at about 70 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. So we ended up slightly less than what the existing OMAFRA recommendation had been, which was not what the growers were expecting. They were expecting that a high yielding sweet corn crop would require higher levels of nitrogen. If we update those numbers, and at that time the average provincial yield was about 7.3 tons to the acre. If we update to 2021 nitrogen prices, so we increase that to 74 cents a pound, our MERN, but we've also got a substantially higher tonnage price, so $161 per ton. Our MERN becomes 80 pounds of nitrogen per hectare, which is basically what the OMAFRA recommendation is. So that was a whole lot of work that we did to end up exactly where we started. Provincial average yield has increased just a little bit over that time. And so that just shows you where the bulk of the sites are fitting into this, really from 60, maximum 120 is where the bulk of the profitability is going to come in those rates across this data set. And then if we add the high prices that we could be at, if we went up to $1.47 per pound of 28%, that really changes my economics there. And my MERN drops all the way down to 50 pounds of nitrogen per hectare. So a much lower economic rate. And I didn't define that. I'm kind of assuming most people on this call already know what MERN is, but the MERN, or the most economic rate of nitrogen, is the rate of nitrogen at which the increase in yield no longer pays for the cost of that nitrogen. So we're no longer getting enough extra yield to pay for that extra unit of nitrogen. So if we look at, so those are averages, and people can't farm on averages. So we need to dig a little deeper, and I chose just a couple example sites to use. And so if we look at the data set, the individual sites within the data set, 18 of those 27 sites had a response that was equal to or greater than the OMAFRA nitrogen rate. So we're looking at highly responsive soils on a very few of the sites, and the vast majority of the sites were captured by those existing rates. So this is an example here. The site has 4% organic matter. It was planted in late May, so decent planting conditions. When we did a PSNT, it came up at 13.6, which is fairly low for that time of year for a nitrogen test. So our MERN at that point was 95 pounds to the acre, just slightly above the OMAFRA recommendation. The PSNT, if we'd use the PSNT values, that would have recommended 80 pounds per acre. So a slight shortfall on that PSNT, but certainly within the ballpark of the most economic rate of nitrogen, both the OMAFRA rate and the PSNT rate. 19 of our 27 sites had a response less than the OMAFRA nitrogen rate, that 90 kilograms per hectare OMAFRA rate. And so that's the bulk of those sites were 90 kilograms or less. And in this case here, we're pulling off an 8-ton crop, and our maximum economic rate of nitrogen was 46 pounds. If we'd use a PSNT, it would have predicted a rate of 45 pounds. So applying that OMAFRA rate in this case would have been an over application, a loss of profit due to that over application. And then we've also got to keep in mind, like Mario already pointed out, that any excess nitrogen in the system is then available to loss, whether it's going through the tiles or whether it's going into the atmosphere. A loss is a loss, and we want to avoid that. And then we had this handful of sites that had no response to supplemental N. So flat line, didn't matter what you did. This is slightly smaller here. It's over an 8.5 ton yield. No response to nitrogen. In this case, the MERN was the rate of the starter, which was 6 pounds per acre, and the PSNT was fairly high. So we knew at side dress time that there was ample amount of nitrogen in there. And so that PSNT recommendation would have said, no, you're good, you don't need to apply. So if we look at the dollar return of nitrogen compared to the most economic rate, because the most economic rate is, it's great for research. If I've got, my 3 or 4 data points and I can graph out my most economic rate, it's only ever going to tell me what it was like in the past. That doesn't help me choose a rate for my crop this year. So if we compare the dollar return to nitrogen across that entire data set, if we had always applied the OMAFRA rate, if I was a grower and I always applied that 80 pounds per acre, or if I don't want to run out, it's that fear of missing out, and I always apply 100 pounds per acre as a grower rate, or I can compare that to using the PSNT rate. And I've outlined what the PSNT rates here were. So from 0 to 10 parts per million, the PSNT recommendation would be 120 pounds per acre. 10 to 20 parts per million, 80 pounds per acre. 21 to 30, we drop down to 40 parts per acre, 40 pounds per acre. And then anything over 30 parts per million, there's ample nitrogen in the soil. No additional nitrogen is required. So when we do the cost analysis on that, if we'd always applied according to the OMAFRA rate compared to MERN, that would have been a loss of $46 per acre. If we'd always applied the cheap insurance rate, the grower rate, then we drop down to a loss of $50 per acre. Whereas if we had always used our PSNT numbers to predict what our rate would be, then compared to MERN, we're looking at a loss of $21 per acre. So of the three options, the PSNT gets us closer to our ideal rate of nitrogen. And in the case of processing late crop, so mid to late crop, that is where, and I think this is what we see in the sweet corn database, is that crop is much better poised to use mineralized nitrogen from the soil. So nitrogen that is naturally there. So if we compare to field corn, which is getting planted so much earlier, getting started in much harsher environmental conditions, then you need to feed that nitrogen to the crop. Whereas in sweet corn, because it's getting planted later, we've got better soil temperatures, we've got more mineralization, there is more nitrogen available there for the crop to use itself. And so that PSNT test really allows us to document that and have some comfort level that dropping those nitrogen rates, it's going to be fine, because there are always going to be those, 5 or 6 sites that are more responsive to nitrogen than the average. So high yielding sweet corn does not necessarily require high levels of nitrogen inputs. 19 of the 27 sites had a MERN less than 80 pounds per acre, and 14 of those sites had a MERN less than 50 pounds per acre. So we're not looking at highly responsive sites across the board. Where we did tend to see more responsive sites tended to be those earlier May planting dates, when we're into the colder soils, when there's less mineralized nitrogen available. The cost of over-applying, the risk of losing money due to over-applying, is greater than the cost of under-applying. So we're more likely to over-apply than we are to under-apply and miss that rate. So it kind of puts aside that fear that I'm not going to have enough nitrogen for this crop. And those sites, those fire responding sites, can be identified by the PSNT.
Okay, well, hello, my name is Joe Tomecek. I assume everyone can hear me. I'll just keep going unless told otherwise. So thank you for having me here. I see that we're getting towards the end here. I'll be able to get through my slides here fairly quickly, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. Okay, so like Colin mentioned before, I'm an independent agronomist in the Chatham area, work with a range of crops, but today predominantly work with processing tomatoes, and that's going to be my focus today. Really talking about what kind of how growers apply their nitrogen, some of the equipment, some of the practices they do, and some of the thought process, and then some of the things that they kind of work through when determining how much nitrogen to use at the end of the year. So let's just click here. Oh, there we go. He's not, there we go. Okay, yeah, so this is just a quick overview. So I'm going to give you a quick background on processing tomatoes, just a very brief one for those who aren't familiar. Some of the goals, then I'll get into some of the goals of nitrogen, a little specific to tomatoes, some of the current practices that growers employ. And then just at the end there, I'm going to touch on some of the things that I would be talking with a grower would work through there to figure out what rate of nitrogen they're going to use on a particular field for their processing tomato crop. Okay, so there's approximately 12,000 to 13,000 acres located in southwestern Ontario, mostly in Kent and Essex counties, but there's some acreage further east there in Middlesex, Elgin counties as well. So 17 contracts, 6 processors. The tomatoes are transplanted, begins early May, and then they'll continue on a schedule until early June. So every grower will start in May, and then every grower will finish up in June. So their acreage is spread out over that 5 or so week period. So there's a range of maturities that the growers deal with. They don't just have the one at the beginning. They at any given time, they're going to have tomatoes at different maturities. Primarily grown on coarse textured soils, so sandy soil, sandy loams, loamy sands. Can work into some heavier, finer texture soils, some clays. But the issue is that all the tomatoes are mechanically harvested. So we need to be working on soils that that are available come harvest time. That, you know, if there's a rain, that the harvest can continue. So just to let you know the type of soils that we're generally working with. So it's kind of your sandier soils, ones that are potentially prone to leaching. Just to give you an idea there, typically most tomato growers are field crop growers as well. So it's in our field crop rotation, you know, field corn, soybeans, some wheat. Occasionally we'll get into some other vegetables. There's a lot of seed corn in this area too. So that will play a role in the kind of our nitrogen rates. And then finally, just harvest can, like with planting there, harvest is staggered. We'll begin mid-August and continue until October, trying to harvest the tomatoes at peak ripeness in an effort to maximize marketable yield. I'm going to touch on that later on, and that continues until October. Oh, okay. So this is just to give you a general idea of you know, what kind of rates that are typically used. Certainly things can deviate depending on conditions, but you know, tomatoes, they require a lot of fertility, or certainly there's a lot of fertility used to try to maximize production based on based on those nutrients. This also comes into play when you look at how much needs to be applied. You know, a lot of this needs to be split up. You know, the potash there applied in the fall, a proportion of it, just to reduce the risk, reduce any potential issues with injury in the spring. But, you know, as far as P2O5, like most crops, MAP is primarily the product that we would use. Well, you know, when you go from anywhere from 100 to 400 pounds of MAP, that's potentially, you know, 10 to 40 pounds of nitrogen just in that product. So that plays a role too, depending on how much we end up needing to use. Like I said, sometimes things can change here. One thing I did want to note, so these are typically, as far as the nitrogen goes, the 150 to 180 actual pounds of N. But I want to note that the crop uptake for a 45-ton tomato crop, we would expect it's going to uptake about 200 to 260, 270 pounds of N. So it really does require or does use a lot of that organic, that residual nitrogen in the soil. And that is important there when we're looking at trying to achieve maximum production. Okay, so here's some of the fertility goals that tomato growers are looking for with their nitrogen specific yield. Let's not overcomplicate this. They're typically nitrogen is very important. It's going to drive yield. It's going to encourage vegetative growth, encourage leaf growth, and then it's going to encourage the setting of flower clusters. So typically the more leaves you have, the bigger your vine, the more flower clusters that you'll have. But there's a limit. There is a limit there. There is a significant risk of over applying. So tomato growers are always very conscious that they don't overdo it because there are limits. Then there are some significant risks of over application. So they're trying to put enough on to maximize yield, maximize the production, the potential, but they don't want to go over, because then we can have excessive vegetative growth at the expense of reproductive growth, at the expense of the flowers. So it may be pushing more leaves, but it won't set as many flower clusters, or there'll be fewer flowers per cluster So that's one thing that growers are very, very mindful of. So aside from just having to, not wanting to over apply to waste money, there's an agronomic risk for over applying. And then how I come back to this, I mentioned that the harvest is on a schedule. Well, by delaying or putting on too much nitrogen, it can delay maturity, or the plant will develop fruit that just doesn't have time to mature in time for harvest, because harvest needs to progress. It's a perishable product out in the field. It won't sit in the field forever. And it doesn't do a whole lot of good to have an unmarketable fruit, or to use higher nitrogen rates to push more fruit if they're not marketable at the time of harvest. Okay, just got my notes here. So this, just to indicate, to give an example of that staggered or drawn out fruit setting. At the lower parts of the plant, they turn red, and then so the fruit setting occurs over a period of time. So really what we're looking to try to do with the nitrogen is push that early season growth to try to maximize the vegetative growth early, and try to get as many fruit clusters set early, and then that gives it plenty of time to ripen in time for harvest. Because at the harvest time, the green fruit isn't worth nearly as much, or really worth anything, when it comes to what the growers get paid for. So not only are we mindful of how much nitrogen we're applying, but we're also mindful of when it's applied, because nitrogen later in the season will not give us the same return as nitrogen applied early. Okay, so I'm just going to run through some of the common practices here, what growers will do when they apply their nitrogen. So it is a technique the guys will use to use streamer nozzles or sprayers to apply 28%. This gives a nice uniform application. I've talked about maturity. So having a nice uniform rate of nitrogen really gives a more uniform maturity across the field. So this is a popular technique that growers will use. Does require an extra pass, but then the growers have an opportunity. Sometimes they'll mix in the herbicides, the PPI herbicides, because in any case, if a grower, there's a fair bit of tillage done, so the grower will incorporate this 28%. So the risk of loss from that standpoint is minimized because it'll be incorporated. If not, then the grower has the option of using a stabilizer. But this is a nice quick way for them to get across their field with some nitrogen. Perhaps a more common technique here would be to use either a spinner spreader or an airflow. What's nice about this is they can apply multiple nutrients simultaneously. They can cover a lot of ground, a lot of volume, but uniformity can be an issue. So then you're left with areas where maybe the nitrogen rate that this particular row got is less than its neighbor, and that's going to influence maturity. Now this isn't a new phenomenon, these zone applicators, but it's becoming more popular. So there's been growers that have been applying the nutrients just over a zone, try to concentrate those nutrients closer to where the tomatoes are growing. Again, in a lot of cases, they can do it with dry products. So trying to be more efficient, but then it's also incorporated into that zone. So if they're more efficient, applied it closer, that plant is not having to work as hard, trying to explore as much of that soil profile to get the nutrients that it needs. But there are limitations with this technique, but this can be useful in, as I mentioned earlier, with the planting being staggered. They can apply these nutrients closer to planting rather than to an entire field, because it wouldn't be uncommon to have a field planted early May and then come back to that field later on in June. So that's 4 or 5 weeks apart there. And if the fertilizer is applied that much in advance, well, there's more risk for loss, more risk of issues. So these techniques let growers apply it closer to when when they're going to be planting. Okay. So just quickly here, this is a technique that growers have done. It started out, they wanted to get some phosphorus closer to the plant, but it was a nice way to inject some 28%. This particular grower, it worked out nicely because they would irrigate with drip tape. The fertilizer was applied in between the twin rows. The drip tape would go right in between those injectors. So when they're irrigating, that soil is right below to where that nutrients are. That's getting the water, the moisture, to make it more available for that plant. And in this case, because we're further away, we can use higher rates of fertilizer there. This wouldn't be considered a starter, but it gives that flexibility. Really, the limitation is how much, how big of a tank they want to carry on their transplanter. But a way to get that fertilizer in the ground where that plant can use it and where it's available. So another way, another form of doing this. So that, first slide there was set up on the planter. Here they have it set up on, yeah, and I'll wrap up here. Let me just work through here. So you talked about a lot of the 28% being used, but now with the price of urea relative to 28%, growers are looking at using side dressing units. So here's a rig that's been rigged up to apply, that could apply urea side dress as well. So some of the things that the growers will consider using here. So certainly the cultivar will affect the rate. Previous crop, and a lot of these things are standard, but certainly the number of frequency of tomato crops will influence the rate. If a field's never seen tomatoes before, we can typically come back, apply less nitrogen. Obviously, application method and timing, whether it's all broadcast or side dressed, cover crops, or organic amendments, manure, all these things come into play. So I've touched on a number of things here. I'll wrap up here. So really, the main thing is marketable yield and trying to get that done, get that available when we need it at harvest time, trying to manage the nitrogen so we don't over apply, but we're trying to maximize that. And like I said, we don't want to over apply. So we really, it's important that we use every but still want to have enough there to push that yield. So we pick our rates and then try to do things to make sure that that nitrogen is there available for the crop. If Mother Nature cooperates, and we can go from there. So anyways, I guess there'll be some questions, and that's all I got. Thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot, Joe, and thanks to Mario and Elaine as well. Yeah, we've gone a bit over time, but yeah, really appreciate each of you speaking. And what we're going to do next is put up our CCA CEU code and our the knowledge sharing event code for the OFCAF. And just in the interest of time, if you've got to get going, please take care of that quickly. And then we've asked our speakers if they're available, if they wouldn't mind sticking around, and we'll do some question and answer as well. So yeah, I don't know, Margaret, if you've got anything to say on the OFCAF program.
Just to let people know that the next intake opens January the 4th to the 18th. And many of those banding practices that Joe talked about could be eligible, right? As long as you're using them on an acre that you as the grower have not used them on before, then they're eligible. So those equipment modifications are eligible if that's what they're looking to do. And I'm happy to answer any other questions if they'd like them. There will be some information sessions that are going to happen virtually, as well as we will have staff at all the county soil and crop improvement association meetings that are going to happen through December and through January. So there's lots of people around to answer questions.
Perfect. That's great. Thank you. Yeah, and if you don't mind sticking around, we'll
Nope,
maybe
I'll
keep
stay.
this slide. Okay.
Yep.
We'll keep this slide open for now then, and we'll get into questions. If anybody's got a question for Margaret, please throw it in the chat there. Yeah, so first question. Nitrogen emission question. NH3 lost from nitrogen fertilizer. So ammonia through volatile ammonia losses. You mentioned the percentage that was nitrous oxide, Mario. What would be a rough percentage of nitrogen fertilizer lost as ammonia gas?
Great question. So it varies. So I think the key thing is, are we putting a nitrogen form on that is prone to being lost? So for example, if we spread urea, leave it at the surface, then it can have a chance of being lost. If we do that when it's really warm, really hot, like a top dress of some sort, then it can increase the chance of losses. Now, if we get a rainfall or irrigation, surface irrigation, within 3 days of that application of the urea at the surface, then we're kind of okay. We're not going to have that much volatilization because the nitrogen gets soaked in the ground where it can't volatilize to the atmosphere. So you kind of get the picture, right? We got to look at the situation and then say, okay, it's at the surface, it's been there for several days. How much can we lose? So Craig Jury had good data out of Harrow on that. And so, but we're talking way more than N2O emissions, and it can vary from 1% as high as 25% under extreme situations with high wind, high temperatures, and some humidity to have that granule kind of dissolve but stay right at the surface. Does that help?
Yeah, that's great. I guess another question that just came in kind of along the same lines of the emissions, of the nitrous oxide emissions from agriculture, how much would be from livestock and how much would be from cropping systems?
So good question. The livestock would there is some from livestock, especially stockpiled cattle manure, and then also from manure addition to soil can lead also to N2O emissions. So by far the largest is fertilizer use, fertilizer nitrogen use, but there is that component from the livestock. It gets a little bit more complicated because every time ammonia goes off to the atmosphere, that can lead to a little bit of N2O emitted. And of course, with barns and storages, especially liquid storages, slurry storages, we can get ammonia volatilized from there. That leads to a little bit of N2O. So, in terms of a split, I don't have the numbers offhand, but I would probably say about 60 to 65% from fertilizer use, and the rest from, not the rest, but major source after that would be from the manures.
Great. Our next question will be for Elaine. Does surface crop residue, soil organic matter, and or CEC levels have any effect on N2O emissions in finer soils for crops such as corn or sweet corn that require high nitrogen needs? And I guess can open this up to everybody, really.
Yeah, I think Mario's probably better poised to answer that than me.
All right.
Can you repeat that, Colin? I was looking at the chat to see if there was something there I could.
Yeah, sorry about that. So surface crop residue, soil organic matter, and CEC levels, any effect on nitrous oxide emissions in finer soils for crops that require high nitrogen needs? So any effect of crop residue, soil organic matter, or CEC on N2O emissions, basically.
Well, the first two will increase N2O emissions. Crop residue is probably not as much as you would think, because you think there's all this carbon that's feeding the bacteria and they'd be super active and producing more N2O. So it doesn't lead to as much N2O as one would expect. The SOM, soil organic matter, from a denitrification perspective, can be a big factor, especially under wet conditions, under wet soil. So if you take some of the clay soils that with higher organic matter, of course, and higher clay soils, especially the ones that they will also have poor drainage, they will be the ones most susceptible to denitrification. Okay. And there can be N2O emitted from there, from that. But by and far, though, just the straight loss of nitrogen as denitrification is a big loss. And it's an agronomic loss of nitrogen on those poorly drained soils. So again, the organic matter feeds the bugs, and then they need to use the nitrate to breathe, in effect, and they use that nitrate and it disappears.
All right. Here's a question that, yeah, maybe is more suited to Elaine. Any work with nitrogen stabilizers or ESN in sweet corn?
No, not by me, and I haven't. It's very hard to find nitrogen work in sweet corn in general. And I think just based on the work that we've done, I think there'd be more opportunity looking at that on early crop and the coarse sandy loam soils, which were kind of outside of our study. But I think that's where, and particularly as we move into a fresh market scenario where we've got soils that are going to be more responsive, we're planting in an environment that's going to be more responsive, then there would be a much better fit for those products there. Whereas in the main crop processing, I don't think that nitrogen's driving the train enough to spend extra money on it, to be honest.
Oh,
We
that
need
makes
it.
sense.
We just,
Next question will be for Joe. With price differences between urea and UAN now, do you see many growers switching to a different source of nitrogen fertilizer in tomatoes? And I guess potentially a more risky source?
Yes, I think so. I don't think that the difference in price can be ignored. I think that some of the growers will be looking at ways they can safely apply that urea. I think the fact that we're on some pretty coarse soils, on occasion we can get into some soils that have a quite high pH. pH is up high 7s, even into the 8s, so quite coarse. So there's risks to going entirely to applying urea, but I think there's techniques that they can use to make it safer, make it a better option. And with that price difference, I think there's some incentive to make that happen.
All right. Question for Mario. Does nitrogen affect the quality of potatoes more so than just the yield?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's very important to regulate the amount of nitrogen, especially towards the latter part of the growing stages as we get to tuber bulking, that we do not have too much nitrogen available in the soil in terms of inorganic nitrogen. If we have too much nitrogen available in the soil, the plant thinks it's full steam ahead for vegetative growth, putting on more vine, and doesn't put its energy into the tuber because it thinks times are great, right? It's not thinking about storage and preservation of itself, which means to make tubers, right? So it's very important. So for example, our growers here come August throttle off the fertigation. And it's because they want the potato to go into bulking. Then also there's impact on gravity, specific gravities of the tubers in terms of the nitrogen. There's a fine line with that as well. And then there could be, and growers would know way more than I in terms of sugar ends and ability to bruise and things like that. So but in a nutshell, there is, and you have to make sure that there's not too much nitrogen towards the end stage of the potato life cycle.
That's great, thanks. Another question for Elaine. Great presentation, nice to see summarized results. I think your slides noted that the responsive site was 4% organic matter, while the non-responsive site was actually 3%. Would have thought higher organic matter would be less responsive compared to the lower one. Do you have any comments on that and why that might be?
Yeah, I think so. The site that had 0 response was 3%. And then our other 2 sites that I showed as examples were 3.7 and 4. I think at that point, I'm not sure, like at that point, really the organic matter level is good enough to support mineralization across the board. And so it's probably other factors at play as well. There's a lot in there. I think that in general, where we're more likely to see organic matter make a difference is where you've got levels below 2.5 to 3. That's where we see more likely to see a response to sweet corn. Yeah.
Okay, great. And maybe one last question here for Mario. A couple kind of related questions on alfalfa, one that you've answered in the chat there. But if I grow alfalfa and there's residual nitrogen, will that residual nitrogen have as much emissions as fertilizer in? And also a second part to that, if you no-tilled corn into an alfalfa stand, would that lower emissions or have any effect on nitrous oxide emissions?
Okay, so I'll answer that by assuming a few things. If we assume that in terms of nitrogen left over from alfalfa, I'm assuming that's from a termination, and then we're planting a field crop or hort crop into it. So there will be a release or mineralization of nitrogen. And that release will happen depending on the temperature and moisture of the post-termination time period. Okay, and so if it's moist and there's heat post-termination, in my area here, termination occurs late summer often, and followed by an incorporation once the burn down takes effect. If it's warm and still moisture in the soil, then you get mineralization of that decomposing, dying alfalfa, right? And then we do not find much emissions of N2O at that time during that that mineralization activity. What we find is that if the following spring, when the soil thaws, we can get lots of N2O, because the nitrate is kicking around and available then to denitrify during that thaw period. Okay, so that we have seen. Okay. The second one was that planting direct into alfalfa?
Yes, no tilling directly into alfalfa.
Now here I'm going to assume that it was termination as well, probably a chemical termination of the alfalfa, right? So there, yeah, so in that case, we're not incorporating biomass. It's really the root system that is what is dying, right? And all I can say is what we've been finding with cover crops, which you plant into cover crops, kind of similar. We're not finding big, and Claudia Wagner-Riddell, who we had last week, has been looking at this with cover crops, not massive emission bursts into a dying cover crop. Okay, so I'm going to assume it's similar to that with the alfalfa. Okay.
That's great. And yeah, I think in the interest of time, I really appreciate you three staying around for a bit longer, but we'll kind of wrap it up there. So thank you to all our participants for joining our talk. Thanks to my colleagues, Steph Vickers, Christine Brown, and Chijendra Chapagain for putting this together. And last but definitely not least, our speakers for giving us time to share their research and knowledge. So we've got a bit of a poll that we'll throw up here if you don't mind throwing a few comments on. And other than that, please join us for the next 2 Wednesdays at noon. That's December 7th and 14th for a deeper focus on field crops next week, and focus on livestock and manure on the 14th to see the research and identify ways to maximize your nitrogen dollar.